Hello and welcome to the Dittrick Medical History Center 2025 and 2026 Zverina Lecture. I'm Amanda Mahoney, Director and Chief Curator of the Dittrick, which is part of the College of Arts and Sciences at Case Western Reserve University. This annual lecture series, made possible through the generosity of the Zverina family, features scholars who explore the history of medical technology, broadly defined, as well as new work in the history of medicine. I'm delighted to introduce this year's Zverina lecturer, Dr. Adam Biggs, who will present a discussion of his current research in a talk entitled Reconstructing the Mission of Medicine, Racial Reform in the Medical Archive. Dr. Biggs is an assistant professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, located in Troy, New York. His research explores how early 20th century Black doctors used professional medicine to advocate for racial justice and examines how understandings of academic and professional merit are shaped by racial politics. His current book project is entitled Strange Cures, Black Doctors, Harlem Hospital, and the New Negro in American Medicine, 1919 to 1935, and examines the role Black doctors played in the desegregation of Harlem Hospital. Professor Biggs has taught courses on the history of race, science, and medicine, race and STS, bioethics, American history, and African American studies, and guides the Racial Justice Lab at RPI. Before arriving in Troy, he held postdoctorate positions at the Scarlet and Black Research Center at Rutgers University and in the Department of History at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He's also served on the faculty of the University of South Carolina in Lancaster and Claflin University.
Close enough, yeah.
Claflin?
Claflin. Yeah.
University. Professor Biggs received his doctorate from the American Studies program at Harvard University. We are especially grateful to the Zverina family for endowing this lecture series in honor of Anton and Rose Zverina with a broad remit that allows the Dittrick and Case Western Reserve University to support emerging research in the history of medicine through our collections. Dr. Biggs is working with the Dittrick's Forest City Hospital archival collection, among some others, for his current book project. A couple of procedural notes. We are fortunate to have technical support from the university's Media Vision department. Thank you very much. If you are experiencing technical issues, for those of you who are joining us remotely, please ask for assistance via the chat function. We will hold a discussion session after Dr. Biggs's presentation as time allows. You can submit questions via the Q&A function during the talk, but please be aware that we're going to hold all questions for the speaker until after the presentation is complete. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Biggs as he presents part 2 of this year's Anton and Rose Zverina lecture series. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you for that, Amanda. So am I sound-wise okay? Yeah, great. Now, it's an honor to have an opportunity to follow up from the talk that I gave in the fall. I'm really joyous about the opportunity to see folks face-to-face and to have a bit of an exchange in that way. I'll say I do feel a little bit like thrown off, I will say. I think, and part of that maybe is just the feeling of it being a hybrid sort of event. I've been taking improv classes for the last 6 months or so, and it's a lot about connection. And so like this is sort of, we're just gonna have to see how this sort of takes shape. But no, I'm glad to be able to sort of be here to share what I've been working on. So as Amanda said, this is part of a larger book project that explores how Black doctors used professional medicine to advocate for racial justice in the early 20th century. It focuses particularly on their role in the desegregation of Harlem Hospital, a process that took place from 1919 to 1935, contemporaneous with the Harlem Renaissance. And my work shows how Black doctors utilized the construct of the New Negro, which was a popular trope of racial modernity at the time, as a model for professional legitimacy, for defining Black health, and as an element of in their therapeutic endeavors. The story I'm telling takes place really at the intersection of two contemporaneous episodes in African American history and the history of medicine, and that is the New Negro movement and the Flexner era reforms. Scholars working in these periods often tend to depict them as parallel rather than convergent moments. And in that sense, I think these works tend to conform to some disciplinary tendencies or boundaries, we might say, that invite anachronistic distortions. The New Negro movement emerged around the turn of the century as a concerted effort by Black civic leaders to challenge derogatory racial stereotypes and to elevate the status of their race by recrafting its public image according to models of national modernity and racial respectability. Likewise, the Flexner-era reforms ushered in structural changes to medical education that substantially elevated the status of the profession, moving it from a questionable trade to an esteemed endeavor and effectively demarcating the emergence of quote unquote modern medicine. I think the limited attention that's been afforded to Black doctors in these respective periods sort of contributes to their balkanization in some ways. And that is to say, it obscures the interrelated nature of racial and medical reform efforts. And that's a big part of what I'm sort of talking about here. Some of what I'm trying to do is to look at the various ways that racial politics are embedded within early 20th century medical reforms. And I'm arguing that reforms in medicine lent themselves to the propagation and the reification of racial hierarchies and relied on definitions of merit that also made it very difficult for doctors to extricate themselves from the structural impetus behind them. So even when we see medical practitioners expressing their commitment to racial justice, I think it's often very difficult for them to avoid being complicit in some of the structural limitations on the forms of exclusion and exploitation that are essentially baked into medical science and the profession. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about here. And we may very well be used to, in some ways at least, to thinking of white physicians in this way. But I also want to talk about how Black doctors found themselves reifying and replicating racial hierarchies and effectively suborning white supremacy, so to speak, even as they committed their lives and careers to advocating for justice. And in that regard, my work indicates how effective professional medicine's bedrock structures are in shaping the behavior of its practitioners. But I also want to suggest that these reforms tell us something about the role professional medicine itself is intended to play in American society. And to the extent that clarifying its role can also help us to clarify how it does and doesn't work. That is to say, what makes medical practice efficacious or not. That's some of what we're going to explore. And with that in mind, I'm embracing Charles Rosenberg's long-standing characterization of 20th century medical therapeutics functioning effectively as placebos, right? Not in an effort to suggest they lack somatic or biomedical substance, but rather because there's such a significant gap between how patients and practitioners understand how modern treatments work. Ministering them successfully requires a tremendous amount of trust on behalf of patients for practitioners, trust and reverence even. And in that sense, the image of the doctor, I'm arguing, plays a significant role in whether or not patients deem their treatments effective. So with that, I'm sort of entering into some fairly new waters for myself in terms of talking about the nature of the placebo, its centrality in medical practice, and meaningful shifts that took place or didn't take place as a result of early 20th century reform efforts. And so some of what I'm hoping we can kind of do is, I'm hoping you'll give me room to kind of work some of these things out or talk some of these things through. All right. And so that's a kind of a long preamble to sort of the beginning of this in some ways. And a lot of times when I'm particularly talking with groups of medical professionals, I feel like there's a virtue in sort of doing this, normalizing some emotions that we may encounter. And these are essentially like the 5 stages of grief, we might say, right? And I think a lot of what I am saying questions some epistemological absolutism and exceptionalism that is often afforded medical science. And I'm trying very much to sort of call attention to the political nature of science as a salient episteme. All right, and I think in sort of questioning that, sometimes, we can have sort of maybe visceral kind of reactions that I'm just hoping we can kind of be cognizant of and sort of take note of and maybe be reflective on. I mean, a lot of what my work is sort of speaks to like Bruno Latour's sort of findings in Science in Action, where he talks about, the construction of fact is a collective process. And the simplest way to get support for a fact is to show how it explicitly furthers someone else's interest, someone's particular interest. So I want us to move away at least, or I want us to be able to think about some of the changes that are taking place, the bedrock changes we associate with modern medicine, with modern and other meritorious tropes that get associated with early 20th century reforms. I want us to talk about them and to think about them as euphemisms that signal middle-class status and practices of racial exclusion that maraud under the guise of professionalism or better medicine, right? And so some of what, I'm not going to presume that everybody who is here also saw my earlier lecture, so I will spend a little time sort of recapping some of the points that are, I think, essential to that. But I'm not going to do that just yet. And I also say this, like, my eyes are not what they used to be. So if you see me fooling around with my glasses, just, those getting older. All right, this is William Thorne. And William Thorne wrote, he said, "We have a greater duty before us," wrote one black doctor from Charleston, South Carolina, "than the mere practice of medicine." Professing the importance of eugenic education for the future prosperity of his race, William Thorne's words from 1924 reflect the obligation many early 20th century black doctors felt to use their medical practices as a means to shape African Americans' racial destiny. A graduate of Hampton Institute who studied at Yale and earned his medical degree from the University of Michigan in 1910, Thorne believed that by galvanizing the forces of eugenic science through medicine, black doctors could improve their mental, moral, and physical qualities to create a better stock, an improved people, a new Negro. He encouraged doctors to advise younger generations on the value of choosing genetically compatible marital partners, maintaining that eugenically informed choices would assure future progeny brought lower levels of vice and disease while maximizing health, fitness, and moral character. These choices, he wrote, should be regarded with the same zest as that possessed by the careful breeder of fine animals, poultry, or plants. They represented the race's chief hope for triumph in future ages, and the black doctor's greatest mission on earth. Now, Thorne's words may seem particularly clinical or off-putting, right? But at a time when cultural refinement and civilization itself were perceived as inheritable race traits, his sentiments were not uncommon among black practitioners. Like other reform-oriented activists of his era, black doctors used eugenic education as a means to cultivate the manners and morals of their clientele in ways that would challenge theories of racial degeneracy and affirm their moral character, social status, and evolutionary fitness. These reform-oriented practices were part of their ongoing efforts to cultivate trust within black communities, which often doubted professional medicine's therapeutic benefits. To gain confidence, they assured patients they would transform them into models of racial modernity, asserting their treatments could offer relief from the most serious afflictions facing their communities, the endemic impact of American racism. Now, in the past, when I have given like different versions or portions of this talk, sometimes they've been well received, but largely misunderstood. And I say that, that people can take a big interest in conversations about black practitioners involved in eugenics. And eugenics plays a meaningful role in the story I'm telling, but that's not the central focus of my work. But lucky for you, it is the central focus of Aya Nuruddin's work. And she's faculty at Yale. She'll be here in a couple weeks. You all will have an opportunity to ask her those questions as well and sort of go on with that conversation. She's doing great work there. But my talk, we're going to go back and talk a bit more about the Flexner reforms. We're going to start with the reforms. I talked about this in my fall lecture, so if you were there, you'll recognize it as a bit of a refresher, but if you weren't, it's an important part of foundation for what I'm doing with this project. And since the late 19th century, the American Medical Association was working with state licensing boards and influential capitalists like Carnegie and Rockefeller to implement more standards that would limit access to the profession, make its practice more lucrative, and elevate the image of medicine. In 1910, their efforts reached a tipping point with the publication of Abraham Flexner's comprehensive review of medical schools in the United States and Canada, frequently referred to as the Flexner Report. While not the first of its kind, Flexner's survey was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation, and carrying the weight of that institution, along with the backing of the AMA, exerted a determinant influence in the decades that followed. Reformers like Flexner framed understandings of academic merit through the lens of hagiographic exceptionalism, or the great man narrative. Heavily influenced by eugenic science, Spencerian theories of evolution, and biological determinism, these reformers saw education as a process of identifying and cultivating exceptional individuals to serve as stewards of society, while weeding out those deemed unfit from the ranks of the educated and professional classes. With the support of the AMA and the Carnegie Foundation in 1908, Flexner spearheaded a year-long effort to survey medical schools in the United States and Canada and helped devise a set of parameters that could be implemented to elevate the profession's social status by more effectively limiting the number, character, and quality of individuals seeking to join its ranks. And so the Flexner Report is pretty well established as, it's been a pivotal moment in the history of medicine. But just to kind of go over some of the myths and truths that are about it. Like, one thing that we want to make sure we don't think of the Flexner Report as a proverbial kind of philosopher's stone in medical reform, right? It's not like the book gets published and then the next day all these reforms are in place. There's a much longer process. It starts decades before Flexner's book is published and continues for decades after it comes out. And I think understanding that it gives us a much more kind of accurate kind of understanding of how historical change takes place over time. I think we need to decenter Flexner in some regard, think more about his connections with the Carnegie Foundation and other wealthy philanthropists who had a determinant impact on making sure these reforms came into being, right? Also, it did not usher in the era of scientific medicine. Physicians had been embracing science in varied forms well before Flexner's report was published. In addition, Flexner's reforms did not lead to a therapeutic revolution. Doctors relied on similar remedies and treatments as they had before the reforms, and their outcomes were generally similar. And in many regards, there were very few distinctions between their outcomes and those achieved by lay practitioners. The most noteworthy impact of Flexner-era reforms was who gained entry to the profession. Ultimately, the report led to the closing of more than half of all the medical schools in North America, with a disproportionate impact on Black medical schools, women's medical colleges, and institutions in the southern and western states that lack substantial benefactors or large endowments. And at a time when African Americans were migrating out of the South, and as impoverished immigrants from Eastern Europe, Asia, and Central America were gaining increased visibility, I want to contend that this was the directed effort to keep medicine as white, wealthy, Anglican, and male as possible. It's not the inadvertent byproduct, that is to say, of more stringent medical standards that are designed to produce better outcomes for patients. These reforms reflect the original intentions of American medical doctors and the Carnegie Foundation to elevate the profession by aligning it more closely with members of the middle and upper classes. And so changes who gets access to the profession, but also does a fairly effective job of shaping the public image of medicine. All right, The report evaluates more than 150 medical schools, grades each institution on their facilities, faculty, curriculum, resources, and students, and gauged whether they were capable of providing the type of education that the stakeholders deemed necessary for improving the quality of North American practitioners. And Flexner, his recommendations implement some of the basic requirements that we tend to associate with undergraduate and pre-medical education today. He expanded the years of college level study and the amount of scientific coursework required for admission, while also mandating degrees from accredited institutions. At the medical school level, in addition to expanding the coursework requirements, Flexner emphasized the importance of access to laboratory facilities for students to perform scientific experiments and hospital affiliations where they could receive clinical instruction. Undoubtedly edifying in meaningful ways for students in practice, the reforms did little to benefit patients or make medicine more efficacious. All right. But what it is very effective at doing is installing these exclusionary sort of structures. They do this by adding significant costs to both the provision and attainment of a medical degree, with a devastating impact on Black and brown communities, women, immigrants, and the poor. Beyond medical education, early 20th century reforms also impacted undergraduate and secondary educational standards. Throughout the 20th century, organizations like the Carnegie Foundation, Rockefeller, led campaigns to mold American education according to eugenic criteria, implementing broad-reaching testing systems and promoting standards of merit designed to propagate social stratification and white supremacy. All right. Yeah, and so these sort of changes really, the curriculum becomes a means of socializing more so than educating. And that is about setting up students or putting students in positions where they feel like they are being measured in terms of their fittedness. But it also is very good at inculcating students with sort of tacit and also often explicit narratives of their own exceptionalism, like what makes them so special. And while encouraging to see themselves in possession of unique talents or gifts that enabled their success, it positions them like that rather than as the beneficiaries of wealth and racial privilege. All right. So these are like two passages that I just want to like bring attention. You know, Paul Starr writes about this, Charles Rosenberg writes about this. You know, science worked greater changes on the imagination than it did on the process of disease. And for the great majority of hospitals and medical men, science functioned more as rhetoric than reality, allowing doctors to bolster their professional standing and advance their careers by cloaking themselves in its mantle. And so part of what both of them, and part of what I am kind of leaning into here, is the symbolic role that science plays, the impact that it has on shaping people's perceptions of medicine, really in a much more cultural, symbolic way than as a somatic biomedical intervention. And yeah, like the point that I sort of spoke to earlier, Charles Rosenberg's sort of notions of how the placebo works in modern therapeutics, he sort of emphasizes that doctors and patients have widely varying understandings of how medical interventions works, and their standards for success vary in meaningful kinds of ways. And I don't think there's really any more better example than that than the age-old sort of joke. The operation was a success, but the patient died, right? Which is just to say that often patients look for different types of outcomes than practitioners do. And that doesn't mean that there aren't somatic, biomedical, meaningful contributions that are being made, but it means there has to be a lot of faith, there has to be a lot of trust between doctors and patients, and that doctors, ability to diagnose illnesses and to pronounce treatments and cures, are often complete acts of faith, right? Where patients get diagnosed for illnesses that are completely asymptomatic, and they're treated for illnesses with treatments that they also can't detect whether or not they are working. So they rely on doctors to read whether it's test results or technology and interpret the images or the findings in ways that kind of represent a black box to them, right? They don't really have access into that shared sort of space of knowledge. And so because they're isolated from the doctor's sort of understanding in health and disease, what we see is, I mean, that's sort of how the placebo actually kinds of works. And I think, you know, when we talk about placebo, it's sort of an interesting thing to do because the definition even of it, I want to say, changes over time, or what we think of it changes over time. Like a placebo, a lot of times we say it was a placebo as though that doesn't mean it has a meaningful kind of therapeutic role to play. But part of what I am doing in the broader sort of narrative of this is really trying to advance Rosenberg's idea of the placebo a little bit more. That is to say, to look at the placebo as a central element of how we understand how professional medicine works, particularly in the 20th century, right? And so maybe one of the things we will do a little bit more of is sort of expand on that or explore a little bit more. But one thing that was very clear in the early 20th century was that Black doctors recognized that the placebo had a valuable role to play in medicine. And so this is, let me see if I can kind of zoom in on these. There we go. So these are two articles that are found in a, one of the early volumes of the Journal of the National Medical Association, A Plea for Suggestive Therapy by W.J. Parks, and the present relation of the psychic to the physiologic and therapeutic in today's practice of medicine. So what I want to do is take a little bit of a look at those. Yeah, so it's probably a better slide we could come up with, but the plea for suggestive therapy. In this article, W.J. Parks from New Jersey wrote, "All of you here have heard patients express themselves as being better as soon as you had entered the room. This is not always imaginary. Maintaining that the therapeutic benefits achieved by charlatans stemmed largely from suggestion, he maintained professional healers were accountable for mastering its use as well. We must not allow the quack to monopolize this portion of our profession, for suggestive therapy is rightly a part of our armamentarium." Relaying his own success with such treatments, Parks related a case where he used hypnosis to relieve a woman from a debilitating nervous condition. At a time when this treatment was instituted, the patient was well nigh an invalid, he explained. However, after her first hypnotic session, he vouched that within minutes, she was perfectly calm, and after sleeping only an hour, she had supper and felt fairly fresh. And so I think this is interesting partly because of how willing we see Black doctors are to actually acknowledge this early on, right? They're saying this is not something that doesn't work. We understand that the placebo has a meaningful impact in our medical practices, and that's not the way we want to go about distinguishing, or we can utilize this. If we sort of yield this to non-professional healers, lay healers, religious healers, then we are going to be missing out on a meaningful sort of part of this process. Let's kind of keep going with this too. The present relation of the psychic to the physiologic and therapeutic. So J.A. Robinson was a Black doctor from South Carolina, commented on this aspect of medical therapeutics, although he despised quackery. And I think there's just interesting room to sort of talk about like where that distinction gets drawn, what's legitimate medicine and what's illegitimate medicine. And I think what we kind of talk about in the next phase of this talk sort of speaks to that. But Robinson acknowledged that charlatans possessed useful skills. If we study the quack and the charlatan and not the wares he offers the public, we would find in him an accomplished student of human nature. Arguing these practitioners were more attuned to the subjective needs of patients than many of his professional counterparts, Robinson encouraged colleagues to make their treatments more efficacious by addressing the subconscious components of illness. Suggestion, he wrote, when properly applied through the nerves of special sense, acts so forcibly on the brain that it will raise the resisting power of the individual, the result of which will be to lessen the devitalizing effect of disease if it is pathological and organic, and completely cure it if functional and without tension. All right. And so I think one of the ways we can talk about how Black doctors and doctors as a whole sort of distinguished legitimate professionals from quacks and charlatans is through this public image that they were crafting, right? And so we talked a little bit about how the Flexner reforms were aimed at doing this. And what I want to do now is talk a little bit about how the New Negro movement came into being and how it sort of played a parallel role that I think illustrates some of what is going on in medicine more clearly. And like I said, we don't see Black doctors appearing in the history of medicine in discussions of Flexner in meaningful kind of ways. The same thing could be said in study of African American history. There's limited sort of dialogue about Black physicians, particularly as sort of practitioners, and their relationship with the Flexner reforms. So they're interesting, I want to say, opportunities to kind of thread a narrative that looks at these moments or this moment as a single rather than sort of a split historical moment. But the New Negro movement was a concerted effort by Black civic leaders to challenge popular stereotypes that depicted African Americans as violent, sexually promiscuous, and a threat to white civilization. And it was part of this collective effort to reconstruct the public image of their race in a respectable light, emphasizing middle-class manners, self-control, cultural refinement, moral character, and accumulated wealth. And so the origins of the origins of the New Negro movement are often put at the Atlanta Exposition, the Cotton States and International Exposition of 1895. And this is where Booker T. Washington delivers what was called the Atlanta Compromise, which was a well-known speech of his era, outlining an accommodationist approach to racial relations while also pronouncing the rebirth of African American citizenship and describing sort of an awakening of African Americans into a new era of industrial progress. Now, evidence of this regeneration comes in the form of a special exhibit on African American progress that's located in the Negro Building. And this is an impressive edifice that's covered in decorative pediment and that chronicles Black achievements since the end of slavery. You see like this image of an antebellum kind of slave mammy is put next to like this log cabin, log church, like a rake and a basket, and is put in contrast with the image of Frederick Douglass, who is supposed to be accompanied by like a stone residence, a stone church, and these various scientific accoutrements and also like symbols of civilization with art and literature. And this is sort of supposed to be a contrast of the old and the new. And inside the building, fairgoers would have seen a broad range of displays that showcase the technological skills and cultural achievements of Black Americans since the Civil War. These installations included agricultural goods and engineered products, displays of educational and civic achievements, business ventures, and examples of fine and domestic artwork. And through this exhibit, Black civic leaders sought to position their race in concert with the larger civic and cultural regeneration said to be taking place at the turn of the century, affirming to the world their standing as modern citizens. Okay. And concerns about racial modernity had been paramount for Black doctors since their earliest effort to organize professionally. And so the origins of the National Medical Association are at the Atlanta Exposition of 1895, where a small cadre of influential practitioners organized the first nationwide medical association open to members of their race, forming the National Association of Colored Physicians, Dentists, and Pharmacists, which later became the National Medical Association. Scholarship on the New Negro tends to focus heavily on the trope's function as a discursive act of negation. That is to say, the effort to distinguish modern and progressive new Negroes from antiquated and disreputable old ones. But turn of the century Americans, both within and outside Black civic discourse, were equally, if not more, familiar with competing images of the new Black citizen. And that is to say, there was this image of the new Negro as being a racial degenerate and the new Negro as being a figure of respectability. So sometimes there's the way that this trope kind of functions is more dynamic than sometimes we give it credit for. It's not just old and new, it's all competing images of the new, and sometimes it's also competing images of the old. Popular media frequently depicted post-emancipation Blacks in pejorative terms, propagating romantic images of docile and contented slaves. They described free Blacks as members of a degenerate race, lacking the refining influence of slavery. This new Negro was a deceitful social menace. Claims of racial barbarism yielded hypersexualized images of lascivious Black women and savage Black brutes, undermining the foundations of white civic morality, threatening the sanctity of American civilization, They provided a rationale for practices of exclusion and justified acute forms of discrimination and violence, including lynching and rape. But early 20th century Black civic leaders responded to these denigrating portrayals by cultivating their own models of the modern Black citizen. Challenging images of racial savagery, they effectively rebrand the new Negro as a progressive racial trope, designating it a proper noun requisitely capitalized, and implementing bourgeois styling to affirm its modern standing. New Negro men were law-abiding and industrious citizens who protected their women and provided for their families. New Negro women were chaste, devoted wives, and good mothers that served as the moral foundation for Black communities. Culturally regenerated and eugenically fit, these new Negroes were the embodiment of respectable manhood and womanhood, characterized by middle-class manners, self-control, cultural refinement, moral character, and accumulated wealth. Not only a motivating force behind the formation of the National Medical Association, Black doctors would come to rely heavily on the new Negro as a driving force behind their professional identities. Deeply invested in efforts to craft and propagate a respectable public image, they were leading proponents of the movement, regularly contributing to racial anthologies and biographical dictionaries designed to contest racial stereotypes. Much like the fair's Negro exhibit, these encyclopedic works stood as testaments to the achievements and capabilities of African Americans. They presented images and narratives of aspiring members of the race, including accounts of Black professionals, religious leaders, and respected families. And as editors, compilers, and often the subject of individual profiles, Black doctors saw these works as part of their larger effort to affirm their race's modern character and propagate the image of the new Negro. And so 2 examples of this are Medical Symphony, which is a biographical kind of dictionary encyclopedia on Black physicians in New York, comes out in 1947, and The Negro in Medicine, which is the same kind of text, but comes out in 1912. And so if I can pull this off, like if we want to get a sense of the type of, and this is just a really, I'm not going to zoom in on these just because it's a little bit too technical, but what you can see is that there's a lot of, there's a good amount of text, but there are a lot of pictures. And the pictures are really these portraits and these profiles, and sometimes they're of individuals. A lot of them are of houses or, let's see, or like apothecaries. Yeah, that's great. Okay. Like, I think if we got it.
I think on the left that you could rotate
Yeah,
it.
rotating my neck is kind of hard on this too. So I'm just gonna you're just gonna have to trust me that like we can look at this more maybe afterwards as well. But now you're making me want to do it. Their images are like hospitals as well. And sometimes it's, let's see, there's like houses that are, here you go. There we go. Like, so this is, well-off house. There's a car. And I think on the porch here, we might even to see like family members, or sometimes they're family members and like servants who are part of it also. All right. So let's go back to, all right. All right, so along with numerous biographical sketches that regularly adorn the pages of Black newspapers, magazines, and periodicals, like we see these texts, right? So we see them in small form that it might be in like The Crisis or in a Black newspaper, but we also see them in these sort of more substantial collections. And so, The Negro in Medicine was compiled by John Kennedy, who was the secretary of the National Medical Association, and also the personal physician of Booker T. Washington. And the intro to that says that this text sought to demonstrate to the public the fact that the Negro was proving his ability, his worth, and his right to American citizenship. In the introduction, it emphasizes how far African American physicians had come from the folk practices of their ancestors and the hoodooism of the African jungles and the root doctoring of the benighted southern slave plantations to the use of modern therapeutics. So from African jungles, southern slave plantations to modern medicine. And throughout, we see doctors appearing in full-page images with immaculate houses, offices, pharmacies, as well as in distinguished individual portraits that affirmed their modern character. They include information about wealth, social background, religion, marriages, families, education, training, professional distinctions, medical discoveries, military service, successful business enterprises outside of medicine, and their overall reputations. And there's an article in at the end of it that's actually in German, or at least the title is in German, and the translation is The Negro in the United States of America, where the author says the black physician has made the greatest progress of any members of their race, and were the best representative of its potential for growth and achievement. All right. Good. And I think these are valuable for a couple of different reasons, but particularly for this reason here, because civic activists also saw these types of text, right? These efforts to sort of craft the image of the new Negro as a therapeutic type of intervention. So Josie Hall is a black reformer from Texas. She's not a trained medical practitioner, but she still had a vision and sort of a sense of the new Negro's therapeutic significance. And so in her anthology, which is called Hall's Moral and Mental Capsule for the Economic and Domestic Life of the Negro as a Solution to the Race Problem, she explicitly links black health to the construct of racial modernity embodied in the new Negro. The race is ill, she wrote, but its abnormal and crooked condition could be addressed by her capsule, the text itself. In the tone of a proprietary medicine salesman, Hall pronounced her capsule was a mixture of valuable ingredients to make a better people and solve the Negro problem. Filled with accounts of black middle-class achievements, she explained, "You will find this capsule to be a mental, moral, and physical restorer, which performs the mission of a purgative, to remove the innutritious burden of mistakes that is keeping the race sick." Right? And so in this sort of depiction of the image of modernity and the image of racial modernity and the image of the new Negro as a type of therapeutic agent, I think when we bring this sort of into dialogue with scholarship about the placebo, it kind of fits into that area that would be called doctor as drug, right? Or as therapeutic agent itself, right? And it says something that about during the ritualized exchanges that take place between doctors and patients, symbolic gestures that convey the doctor's professional authority and respect for the patients help frame diseases and treatment measures in ways that affirm patients' dignity, civic value, and social standing, with critical implications for their perception of therapeutic success. So John Burnham, God rest his soul, talked about this, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. He said, patient perceptions of medical care stem disproportionately from the quality of their interaction with doctors rather than their technical appreciation for the efficacy of a particular diagnostic or treatment method. I think that in many regards, that's probably still the case. Patients expecting affirmation and support responded negatively to doctors who failed to maintain sacerdotal dispositions or who performed administrations with callousness or disregard. And for African American patients in particular, uniquely aware of their marginalized social status and sensitive to the possibility of exploitation, the ability of doctors to inspire confidence and build trust by affirming patients' self-worth, middle-class aspirations, and civic value was critical to the success of their therapeutic interventions. Right? And so we see early 20th century doctors taking great pains to cultivate this image, an image of status and distinction, or to cultivate this sort of symbolic class gap between themselves and patients in a way that assures patients that this person is not only respectable, but perhaps also provides them with a degree of access to what I would call a sense of like social mobility or civic value. While the rise of modern medicine is often attributed to the centralization of medical authority and the expanded use of research-based laboratory science. It was the cultural value of these developments, their symbolic impact on the public's perception of doctors as esteemed professionals, more than the technical benefits that led to medicine's increase. Darlene Clark-Hine kind of talks about this when she talks about Matilda Evans' work in South Carolina. She talks about how Evans really cultivated notions of sort of racial respectability, or presented herself in a way that was particularly dignified and particularly sort of aligned with notions of respectability. And embraced the Black club woman's politics of respectability, piety, and service in her practice, referring specifically to those progressive era racial reform leaders to shape those efforts to shape manners and mores and behaviors in ways that would challenge racial stereotypes and affirm middle-class aspiration. Hines says the politics of respectability functioned within the medical profession as a means through which Black doctors could build standing and invite deference by regulating behavior. Through the cultivation of refined bourgeois manners and appearances, they sought to gain patients' trust by presenting themselves as representatives of modernity or embodiments of the new Negro. And by projecting this persona, they promised benefits that went beyond the technical treatment of disease, affirming their patients' middle-class aspirations and offering relief not only from somatic afflictions, but also the denigrating effects of racial prejudice and discrimination. All right. So, and I am going to just try to, I have a few more things that I think I'm going to sort of push through them a little bit. But these have kind of, to call it like a scandalous kind of nature to them if you just aren't used to looking at these works by Black physicians. And what we kind of see happening here within the Black medical community, we see very deliberate efforts to police the behaviors of other Black practitioners. And so what we kind of also come to recognize here is that part of what it means to be the new Negro is about figuring out who the old Negro is and then sort of targeting them as a sort of a point for reform. Like, this is somebody who needs to change. So the critique in some ways elevates the status of the individual, right? But so this is Algernon Jackson, Black physician from Philadelphia. And he's making a point to hold his colleagues accountable for embodying the new Negro and cultivating it in parents. And he said he directs his wrath toward Black dentists, reminding his colleagues of their obligation to mold patients into models of respectability, referring particularly to cosmetic dentistry. Jackson lamented that well-trained dentists find themselves falling victim to the persuasive and ignorant vanity of their clients who want mouths more decorative than healthy. Very few, he continued, have the courage to persuade a prospective patient that high-grade sanitation and protective dentistry are worth more to him than the reducing of his mouth to the appearance of an ornate jewelry store window. Aware that jaw and tooth structures were directly tied to phrenological classifications of race and indicators of racial capacity, Jackson recognized that these failings in the practitioner's character and judgment were not only detrimental to the patient's health, but reduced their professional standing, jeopardizing the status of their race and degrading the profession. As long as our dentists consent to the desire for vulgar displays to satisfy ignorant patients, he wrote, we cannot do otherwise than classify them as glorified blacksmiths whose field of endeavors is limited to Negro mouths rather than to the hoof of a jackass. So spicy. But you kind of get a real sense that, right, part of the critique is like the role of medicine is to build this patient, this respectable patient. Like it's spicy, but if we, like the meaningful part of it is that you're supposed to be promoting this image of respectability in patients that's really middle class, that's bourgeois, that doesn't, not gold teeth, not grills, not, things that don't fit sort of the model of respectability. And your ability to do that also reflects on your legitimacy as a respectable practitioner. And this is, very much sort of this effort to call practitioners to task in that regard. Yeah, Rivers Frederick out of New Orleans, similar kinds of things. While he recognized the value of suggestive therapies and thought to police the line between their legitimate and unethical uses, in his oration on surgery, Primitive Surgeons in Modern Medicine, Frederick asserted that an honest evaluation of a patient's complaint not infrequently requires time-consuming and expensive procedures and never too often techniques of the psychological realm. However, to many, the object is to give more time to the ritual of examination carried out in an impressive setting with a certain degree of pomposity. Arguing such methods could rival the right of the mystics, Frederick stressed the importance of using the tools of medical science legitimately. The light at the end of the proctoscope, he said, does not illuminate the observer's mental faculties unless he has an honesty of purpose with an objective in view. Frederick condemned those who use technology for exaggerated showmanship to exploit their patients. Such thinking, he maintained, prostitutes the knowledge and surgical skill that has been developed, and he degenerates into the medicine man of years gone by. And so those kind of words like degenerate is very racially coded. The medicine man this is identifying the old Negro. But I also think it's worthwhile to think about the vehemence in which these critiques are made. Like this is, it's easy to sort of think about this as, I want to say like the bickering of the petite bourgeoisie, like that these are just sort of like, how do you say, they're just trading sort of insults in some kind of way. But I think this is interesting that this kind of language gets reserved for this kind of endeavor. Like there's a certain level of vitriol that they kind of hold for this. And if we look through them, as being something other than like what we would sort of imagine on reality TV, to actually having, like they are reserving that level of bitterness for this type of practice. I think it speaks to how important it actually was to them, like how much it actually mattered. And then, so this is like, this will be the last one I kind of show of this. And Thomas Jefferson, West Palm Beach, Florida, no less vehement in vocalizing his distaste for practitioners who fail to maintain the ethical standards that accompany the image of the new Negro. And that was entitled to this piece, The Old Negro and the New Negro. That's the book. The new Negro doctor, he began, will not always, when he finds a patient with money and a willingness to pay, discover some serious ailment that is going to take a long period of time to cure and that will require his constant and regular care for such patient to ever get well. Neither will a new Negro doctor, when he finds a patient with money to be suffering with some incurable disease, encourage and make him believe that he can cure him until he gets all of the patient's available cash, and then just find out that the patient has some incurable disease and recommend that he go to some free clinic or sanitarium. With an emphasis on values, Jefferson stressed that black doctors should be of high moral character and well educated in heart and hand, as well as in the head, and having the best interest of his people at heart. There's an article that Todd Savitt wrote. I want to say it was like black doctors in entering medicine. I want to say this came out, I want to say it was the late 80s, early 90s, where he also talks about how these critiques were made about black doctors, making more of an effort to buy a new car as soon as the model came out, but not really putting that money toward things like building up a good medical library for themselves. So this idea of sort of all this emphasis put on flash rather than on substance. But I think the other part of this is that there is a reason why black physicians would have made those kind of decisions. And it wasn't just because they were petty, right? Or just like enjoying the fruits of their labors. I think there are meaningful aspects of that relate to their practices. So this kind of, this is the central part I do want to take away from that William Thorne piece. That is, we have a greater duty before us than the mere practice of medicine. That doctors saw medicine not just as a part of a means for addressing sort of reductionist notions of illness or specific afflictions, but that they did see it within this larger, and quite explicitly saw it within this larger process and purpose of racial advancement. And I want that to kind of be a theme that I think we can also take and sort of expand when we talk about medicine more broadly. I don't think we think about Black doctors as being some ghettoized element of the profession, right? Even though they're marginalized in many regards, they also reflect some of the profession's central tenets and values. And I'm good to talk about that a little bit more. But what I want to do also, I want to take just a minute to kind of look at a couple of the materials from the for Forest City. And what I kind of, this was, I think this was an administrative, in the administrative kind of collection. And this is like an informational pamphlet that I am not going to, well, yeah, we go. That just has some sort of interesting sort of moments in it, I want to say. And I want to look at the first 2 points on this. It says, Forest City Hospital, a community service, belongs to all the people, and all are welcome to join the Forest City Hospital Association. So it's making this very meaningful kind of gesture toward inclusion. But when you go down and look at the note that gets added here, it says Forest City Hospital Association members have a voice and a vote in governing the hospital. And I think one of the things that's interesting about that is that it is talking about having patients. It's a more democratic setting than a lot of medical, I want to say, settings can be. This idea that patients will have a sense of governance and a sense of connection with it. But if you look down on 10, right, it says Forest City Hospital is not restricted. Eligibility on the hospital staff is open to anyone possessing the proper professional qualifications. This has an influence for good on other hospitals locally and nationally. And I think, so part of what it seems to me like this is saying, this emphasis on proper professional qualifications is kind of an interesting way of, I think, sort of also gesturing to these notions of propriety and respectability. But let's also kind of look at some other aspects on this. So this is a letter that is to Malbahu Bryant Mason, who was the wife of Ulysses Mason. One of the things that she's involved with here, it says, I'm enclosing the program for the National Council of Negro Women's Institute and the Reservation Forum. So the National Council of Negro Women was a group that was begun by Mary McLeod Bethune in the 1930s, very much connected with this Black Women's Club movement and these notions of racial respectability, very much sort of invested in this concept of propriety and the new Negro. And then we also, we have these images of like events that the Women's Auxiliary was hosting. And I think these are interesting too, because there are a number of events of where we see like these fashion shows taking place. And we can also tend to diminish fashion shows as when we talk about sartorial choices, right? We can diminish them as being something that is just sort of flippant or insignificant. But I think this is a particular type of image that they are showing, right? This is taking place in 1976. And I think there's an element of bourgeois styling that's embraced there, right? That this is not sort of a signifier of, it is a signifier of civic elevation and social status and elevation, I want to say. And also I want to say the image of the, this person here, that which is to say this representative of the showcase. Also, I mean, a very kind of respectable, very kind of contained image that sort of suggests a certain type of personification that is going on at these events. And then let's just look at, No, I really liked this part also because these were also from the Women's Auxiliary. They talk a lot about how they were getting teenagers sort of involved in the workings of the hospital, and they did things like they run the snack bar or the thrift shop, or they help count the tax stamps, or the sewing group or the Christmas card club, I want to say, and helping with the editing of their auxiliary newsletter. And so these various ways that are also sort of designed to go and cultivate a connection with the hospital that are outside the actual practice of medicine, but that which build a sense of trust, that build a sense of connection that goes beyond just the therapeutic kind of encounter between doctor and patient. I think these are kind of things that we see being very important. And I think this is actually a really good reason to talk a lot more about the role of women's auxiliaries in Black hospitals in particular. But that doesn't mean that, that these moments weren't kind of filled also with tensions. And, the NAACP was very much resistant to the idea of the Forest City Hospital being built in the interest and service of Black physicians. And there are a number of reasons for that, but that's not uncommon that we see competing sort of visions of what racial progress looked like, what racial modernity looks like. The NAACP did not always side with Black physicians with the idea of building hospitals for them to practice. And so I think there's an interesting kind of conversation here there. And I'm inclined to stop there, except that I just have this image of like James Baldwin. And I love this quote. And it's up here, so it's worth it, I think, to kind of just to touch on it. It must be remembered that the oppressed and the oppressor are bound together within the same society, accept the same criteria, share the same beliefs, or both alike depend on the same reality. Within this cage, it is romantic, more meaningless to speak of a new society as the desire of the oppressed, as it seems to me what the rejected desire is an elevation of status, acceptance within the present community. Thus, the African exile pagan hurried off the auction block and into the fields, fell on his knees before the God in whom he must now believe, who had made him but not in his image. This tableau, this impossibility is the heritage of the Negro in America. Wash me, cried the slave to his maker, and I shall be whiter, whiter than snow. And then, because I just like the way these sound. All right, this is the last one I'll show. But this is also from Nathan Huggins, and this is kind of a critique of like the idea of modernity. He said the problem, he wrote, was in the metaphor itself. This is from his book on the Harlem Renaissance. Whether it was the new Negro or new American, whatever promise the new man has for the future, his name and the necessity for his creation imply some inadequacy in the past. The debut of the new Negro announced the dissatisfaction with the old Negro. And since the old-new dichotomy is a mere convenience of mind, Afro-Americans were really the same people all along. The so-called old Negro was merely carried within the bosom of the new as a kind of self-doubt, perhaps self-hate. How can one say that Negroes are worthy and civilized and new men without at the same time acknowledging doubt and denial? And I'll stop there. Thank you, folks.
Thank you so much, Adam, for sharing work that you're like in the thick of.
Yeah.
That was really fascinating, and I for one have a number of questions. So we do have time for some questions. So we're going to start with in-person questions, and then try to share some of the questions from our virtual audience. And if you joined us a little bit late, or if you'd like to share Dr. Biggs's work and this talk with students or colleagues, we will have a recording posted on our website. I also want to bring to your attention that there's an exhibit at the Western Reserve Historical Society entitled Race, Place, and Community-Based Healthcare in Cleveland, Ohio, circa 1957 to present. This is curated by Dr. Virginia Williams, and it draws upon this the Forest City Hospital collection, which is held in the Dittrick Medical History Center archives here. And it also draws on some really wonderful primary sources related to the history of healthcare in Cleveland. And these include archives and oral histories related to the Cleveland Council of Black Nurses, the Doctor's Pharmacy, and the Glenville Medical Center that many historians of medicine and folks interested in the history of medicine would find fascinating. The exhibit runs through September, and you can visit the Historical Society's website for more details. Okay, so now on to questions for Dr. Biggs. And if you have questions that emerge as the Q&A continues, please put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them. So any questions from the audience?
It's a comment and a question. Mm-hmm. I'm a social historian, okay? So all I could think of was, what goes around comes around. Mm-hmm. And in your studies, what kinds of comparison contrasts are you looking for and are you doing between what was happening in society at that time, in the broader society, and it's, I don't know, bi-directional is kind of what I saw, impact of one on the other. I'm going to give a primary example of what I mean, which was these biographies of doctors. I did all my history work in Cleveland, so I've seen these biographies of Cleveland's doctors between 1855 and 1895, and I always saw it as vanity publishing, a form of vanity publishing, and I always saw it as a marketing tool, but for what I've seen. And I also saw that in what you presented to us, just as an observation. Wow. Pardon my mouth here. I don't mean to be insulting. They were doing it too.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And then you think about what the Poles were doing and what the Jews were doing and blah, blah. So that's, I said, it is a question. What are you looking at? And are you drawing these?
Well, it's funny that you kind of mentioned that, because I remember looking at these books and, like, when I was first doing this, struggling to really find materials that were related to Black physicians, but these were what came up the most. And it just struck me as, like, they always read very dry, right? You never look at them and say, wow, this is like it's because it's all the same story. It's all the heroic narrative. But there are interesting things that do come up in them, right? Like, a lot of times, I mean, there were a number of, like, collections or some that were focused on, like, Black doctors in Cuba, right? And so they would talk about how the practitioners there were comparable to any at, Meharry or at the Mayo brothers in Minnesota. But a lot of times they would say things like, and not only were they matching white practitioners in skill, but they also could be mistaken for a white practitioner or a white person, right? So that they were able to pass for white. And so this kind of becomes, and I think this is part of what is sort of underlying some of what I'm talking about here, like how narratives of whiteness very much get associated with medical authority, right? And doctors recognize that as well. Black doctors recognize that as well. And it's not uncommon that if you look back at, a historical moment that involves a Black physician, that there's a pretty good chance that they will have a very fair complexion. And some of the most notable Black practitioners sort of in the pantheon, you might say, of historical figures were able to advance their careers sometimes because people did mistake them for white, right? And so I think the thing, I mean, these books are, in some ways, they are certainly I want to say they come across as vanity, right? And they certainly come across as like marketing. I think that's exactly what they are. I think a lot of what we kind of see happening, but they're reflections of what we're seeing valued like in the reforms that are taking place. And sometimes it's even like the form of the text that I think is pretty interesting. Like some of these volumes, these dictionaries are huge, right? They're weighty. And so they carry this sense of sort of being immutable, right? That sort of they are sort of these monuments to a certain degree of achievement. But doctors, I mean, a lot of times took a lot of investment in sort of studying the biography, right? They saw themselves as sort of cultured by studying other doctors' biographies, more so than even, you might say, their scientific works. And they put a big emphasis on this idea of sort of hagiography, right? That is, say, the great man and the image of the great man. And I think that's in many ways affected how, we've looked at the history of medicine, but it's also in some ways a reflection of doctors being involved with writing their own histories, right? Where, I mean, it's, in all fairness, like I think we see like the reforms that take place in medical education become like the standard for reforms that also take place at the undergraduate level, but then also at the secondary level. And so what we see happening there, that narrative of hagiography kind of becomes ingrained in a lot of the American education system. So like when you apply to a school and you are writing an essay, really the only narrative people are, or a cover letter, or a job in that case too, the only story people want to hear is the hero's journey. They want to hear about how great you are, how fabulous you are, right? Nobody wants to really hear about, like if there is a struggle, it need only be to amplify how fabulous you are. And so this is very much sort of how we kind of understand professionalism in some ways. It's through these sort of hagiographies. So this happens very much late 19th, early 20th century, but I think it's hard to say it would have dissipated since then. So.
And just to follow up, I know for a fact that it happened in social work too.
Yeah.
Those are the two categories that I looked at.
Yeah. Okay.
So.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, also, Dr. Biggs. I'm Peter Whitehouse. I had as a mentor in psychiatry Jerry Frank, who wrote a book, Persuasion and Healing, in which he looked across different healing traditions, including comparing different cultural contexts, indigenous healers, and also speaks a lot about the placebo and the kind of what you were talking about, science as having a certain contemporary veneer, not that it doesn't have depth as well.
Right.
And my daughter did a thesis on the community health workers in the African American communities in the Civil War. So my question is, as you described these efforts of Black physicians to become more professional, how did they relate to the Harriet Tubmans, the nurses, the community workers, the people that provided healing to those communities? Right. Did they ally with themselves? And this is another question in social history, I guess, because it's things repeating themselves. Or did they see them as forms of healing they had to reject in order to take on the mantle of the new scientifically based medicine?
So I think the answer to your question might be both, which is to say that a lot of times the way they relate to nurses or other like allied health professions practitioners is paternalistically, right? So they sort of are saying, well, this is, and a lot of Black physicians will celebrate the efforts of Black nurses, right? But they also adopt the same sort of orientation that you see like other, white physicians adopting toward nurses as well. What's interesting is to see how Black male doctors related to Black women doctors, which was also, you could say paternalistic, but also resentful in many ways, where there are a number of examples where you see Black male doctors don't want to collaborate, they don't want to work with, they don't want to, work with Black women doctors and are often kind of insulted like when they take a position on staff, right? Because there's a sense that, well, you're sort of not in the right role, right? There's something about, manliness that is sort of embedded in how we understand medicine. And I still can't remember, we talked about this yesterday and I looked it up, but I cannot remember. Is it Charlotte Brock? No. No, this is not, no, this is, I'm trying to remember. There's some work being done that looks at the role of manliness and early 20th century reforms that sort of emphasizes how fundamental this was to even medical education, right? Where physicians played on the football team because there was a sense that vitality was an important part. Now you can kind of imagine that now, right? Medical students playing on the football team. I guess it happens every now and then, but still, like, it's not the kind of thing that you associate with it. But when we think about sports being connected with education, right? A lot of times it seems like, there's a school connected with the football team or something like that. There was a time when those were much more intimately tied to one another, when the idea of sort of physical exertion was much more embedded in the idea of sort of the education process and the growth of the individual and the cultivation of the individual. And so there is a sense that manhood and manliness and masculinity is embedded in sort of notions of professional merit in medicine. And that's something that women doctors and black women doctors had to navigate in really, I think, sort of extraordinary kinds of ways. There's a lot of room to talk about sort of queer theory, you could say, in sort of Harlem Renaissance era, black women physicians really sort of not only transgressing sort of the sort of dichotomies of sort of manliness and medicine, but also within the community of black male physicians, different sort of displays of gender performance, right? That don't always fit this idea of rugged masculinity that come into question. That we're, by being something other than sort of, by being something other than this sort of rugged masculine kind of machismo sort of image, you were seen as being less than rigorous, less than legitimate in ways. So yeah.
Dr. Biggs, I'm flattered that you thought I would remember
No,
that
I
historian.
was looking for
I'm so sorry that I disappointed you.
Sorry.
But I have a question. I think that it is shocking and disappointing that one of the shared values between black physicians and white physicians seems to be contempt for patients, particularly indigent patients and black patients. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, so this is, I think this is kind of what that quote from James Baldwin maybe signifies a little bit of. It's not necessarily clear that, I think there's a sense that black doctors value black patients much the same way that white physicians sometimes valued black patients, and that is to say that they saw them as opportunities to develop specialties or to treat, to become more effective practitioners in surgery. And I don't know if I would say it's universal, disparagement toward the patient. I think there is certainly condescension. I think they're often more sort of justice-centric advocates in their publications, right, where they are challenging perhaps medical science that suggests black patients won't respond to certain diagnostic treatments or other kind of therapeutics, and also in sort of advocating for different types of public health, right? But I also think there's also having conversations with different folks, right? Physicians have an understanding of what health is supposed to be, and they see themselves as sort of having a monopoly on that. And oftentimes they are contrary to how patients sort of understand what they want to get from the practitioner. And so I think, I don't think that's unique to them in any way necessarily, but I do think, it is sort of an interesting kind of story to tell that like at Harlem Hospital, part of the impetus for desegregation was that white physicians were discriminating against black patients and not treating them well. But when black doctors do get on staff, there's not really a sense that patient care improves in meaningful types of ways, right? There's still issues that come up. And my story ends sort of in 1935. The desegregation starts in 1919. My story ends in 1935 when a riot in Harlem breaks out, right? And part of it is that, I mean, there are a lot of people involved with this who are sort of well-known figures in the history of medicine and in African-American history. But part of what they discern, and I think it was under Mayor LaGuardia, is that the conditions of the hospital had triggered some of the unrest. And so there are different ways that patients speak, right, sort of in these kind of moments that isn't necessarily the same way we would sort of, like they're not having a conversation in the journal of the National Medical Association, but they do kind of let it be known that, and where doctors have to listen, like Harlem Hospital's black doctors got the message that whatever dispute was going on within their black medical community at that time, that they needed to be a lot more quiet about it. Like, I think there was a sense of that. It felt like some vehement, bitter rivalries that had formed on over different definitions or different understandings of what racial progress in this hospital would look like. And what really kind of happens is that I think the message of the riot is that patients weren't interested in that. Like, so yeah.
We have a question from our virtual audience. Dr. Sarah Rubin says, you're bringing together so many different types of data. What fascinates you the most, and what is possibly the most important for making your argument? And if she can ask one more question, what did you wish that you'd found in your archival research that you haven't found yet?
What do I wish I had found? I don't know about that. Like that's kind of like, I don't know. Like, what kind of family would I have wanted to be born into? You know,
you don't want to jinx it.
Yeah,
we'll help you. We'll help manifest those primary sources for you.
Yeah, I think it's the thing about the primary sources. The things that I find, I think, are kind of extraordinary in and of themselves, right? And part of the reason why I was doing this is because of the types of primary sources that I kind of encountered, and they raised so many kind of provocative questions for me. When I started this project, I was much more working on a literary biography of Walter White, right? So looking at he was the executive secretary of the NAACP in the 1920s and also an author in the Harlem Renaissance. And I was reading through his work, and I was approaching this as a cultural critic. And I mean, my undergrad degree was in literature. And when I saw, well, he had some black physicians as characters in his literary works that I took interest in, and I learned that these were sort of based on real people that he knew, that he was friends with, and who also were active in the NAACP and were civil rights activists. And I think what happened was when I learned that, I just became aware of an entire community of black physicians who were active in civil rights in the early 20th century, who I hadn't heard of, and I hadn't heard much about them at all. And I had been doing, English and African American Studies was my undergraduate degree. And so really this kind of opened up a space for me to think about to think about civil rights, but also to think about the field of the history of medicine. And I tell this joke, and it's not really a joke because it's true, but like when I started graduate school, I had friends in like the history of science department, the history of medicine, and I just thought what they were doing just had to be so boring. Like, it just was ridiculous to me that like somebody would spend that much time, working in a field that was just going to be talking about, these minutia of white guys who had been, and their achievements, because I was thinking of it in this hagiographic sense, right? But when I really actually started to get into it, there were just so many provocative questions or compelling questions. So much of the history of Harlem Hospital and the history of black doctors is about these conflicts that are sort of emerging within this community. And like, it's easy to sort of dismiss them. But I think the more I sort of became familiar with the history of medicine, the more I became familiar with like the philosophy of science, the more the conflicts started to take shape in sort of in meaningful types of ways. And it just sort of led me to questions that frankly I just could not let go of, right? I was working on a different dissertation topic, like when I started working on this, right? And I think it really just hits on some really kind of fundamental, sort of compelling, I'd say themes that really challenged my perception of African American history, my perception of civil rights activism, and my perception of these sort of efforts to promote racial modernity that frankly, I just have yet to get old for me. So, I think that was kind of, maybe that's it. Like, there's something about, for me, taking the critical perspectives that came with African American history and African American studies and sort of being able to take those into the history of medicine and not sort of looking at them as parallel or separate sort of entities, but sort of in a single narrative thread, just, I think, put me in a position where I could, it was kind of like, revelatory moments, it seems like, that sort of changed, like, what is Cornell used to say, like, these moments where you realize your fundamental presuppositions and tacit assumptions rest on pudding, right? Where you rethink what you're doing in some real fundamental type of way. And I think it just kind of opened up really these powerful kind of moments for empathy. Black practitioners who were very much committed to these models of medical excellence, who we would look back on and say, here's a figure, here's Lewis Wright, here's Daniel Williams, here's a range of it, Charles Drew. And these are folks who are also become like the villain in a number of, you could say, desegregation processes in black hospitals, like in the politics that shape it, because they have this elite type of education that came from Harvard or came from McGill or came from Michigan or Yale. And you get this group of practitioners who are graduates of Howard and graduates of Meharry, and who are saying, we were equally sort of involved and committed with you in these campaigns for desegregation. And then once we get access to these hospitals, you're saying we're not qualified to participate in them anymore. And it's really kind of an extraordinary thing, right? Because everybody is working in good faith, right? At least how I look at it. Everybody's working in good faith, but they have very different understandings of like what sort of their moral compass actually, or their ethical compass actually is. And I think it's easy to look at some figures that are sort of, that fit a model of sort of professional excellence and say, other folks just didn't understand them because they didn't reach their level of sort of achievement. That they were models of black excellence that shouldn't have been critiqued. But in a lot of ways, we also see that those models are also very much aligned with eugenic notions of eugenic hierarchies, that they're aligned with sort of understandings of, or at least proximities to whiteness that goes uncritiqued. And so, it really does. That's not a direct answer to that question, but it is kind of like.
I'm still processing that you used to think the history of medicine was boring.
Really?
And we are coming up on 6 o'clock.
Okay.
And we will have a few minutes for those of you who are with us physically and not just spiritually, to ask a couple more questions. But thank you to everyone for attending the Zverina lecture. And we have another round of applause for Dr. Biggs.
Thank you. Thank you all.
provided a kind of dual outlook on the new black man.
Good, yeah.
Which it seems physicians fell under at the time. So which outlook did the physicians of the time prefer? Would they rather be seen as the exception to the old Negro, or did they want the perception to be that any old Negro was a deviant from them?
Okay.
And I ask this because you referenced that they started to add to anthologies about at least to like make the perception and the light of the Negro, if not better, then at least more accurate. And if so, like that, like where is the fight or addition to a literary analysis like the Flexner Report that I'm sure they saw as making them more prestigious, but also making the race as a whole more sick and therefore not as advanced as the white man and stuck in like the old Negro perception.
So, and I guess, and I'm gonna just, I don't know if that'll stay up, but that's fine. I think it's fair to say that there are, even among sort of modern new Negroes, so to speak, there are competing ideas about who they are and what they represent. And we see a lot of this conversation going on, like during the Harlem Renaissance, conversations going on between the artists who are involved with this, who actually do a much more sort of nuanced critique of this sort of narrative of sort of bourgeois modernity, right? And that's what we largely see Black physicians sort of embodying and presenting in these racial anthologies, and when they are talking about how they should behave in public spaces or how they should behave in professionally, what that sort of embodies. And it is about this sort of bourgeois respectability, right? But it's also sort of suggests a level of proximity to whiteness in a way with this also, okay? But there are, like within these groups, like this is a very dynamic sort of position to hold, right? And so in Harlem Hospital, after the desegregation process takes place, there's a group of Black physicians who are sort of affiliated with elite or graduates of elite medical institutions, and those who are from Howard and Meharry who are sort of at odds with each other. Before the desegregation process sort of gets put in place, they're all members of the same medical society, the North Harlem Medical Society. When this conflict goes down, the society splits in two. There's the North Harlem Society, and then there's the Manhattan Medical Society. And the folks who were sort of saw themselves as part of the elite camp went to the Manhattan Medical Society. But then things would happen, right? Where it turns out like their vision of which camp they were in was flexible, right? It was more fluid than we might expect. And so an event would take place in the North Harlem Society and people would go over to the Manhattan Society. And then sometimes something would happen in the Manhattan Society, or somebody would say something that got covered in the news and people would leave and go back to the other society. So it wasn't like there was a clear line about, you know, our team and their team, right? There was a lot of fluidity in that. And I think when we talk about modernity, and in a lot of ways, modernity is very much like a moving target, right? Like at different moments, even in like the fairly short time period that I'm kind of looking at with Harlem Hospital, it changes, and there are debates about who's sort of the newest of the new Negroes, and that's kind of what the conversation is about. Like, what are we doing? How are we embodying this idea of modernity? And I think in many regards like that, you started to sort of ask that about like Flexner as well. And I think what we see happening within the Black medical community is actually more indicative of how things are taking shape within like mainstream medicine as well. It's not, like I said, it's not like, I mean, they are on the margins, but in that sense, they are actually a powerful lens into how these conflicts emerge within predominantly white institutions and organizations as well, because they are so rigid about maintaining their racial boundaries, and they're so invested in them. And I think it is very easy to kind of think that these are race neutral, right? If we just kind of look at them and we say, oh, you know, science is absolute, and, you know, science is sort of this exceptionalist kind of epistemology or way of knowing something, right? It's unique to other ways of knowing things. But I think when we look at like the impact that these reforms have, and that's I think how we should be looking at understandings of like scientific epistemologies. We need to look at not what their stated sort of goals are, whether that means it's, because when people say it's about objectivity, it's about sort of avoiding political implications to it, right? What we really need to look at is the outcomes. And that's kind of what Bruno Latour is talking about. Like something becomes a fact. You can tell when it becomes a fact when it serves the interest of a certain group of people. And so one of the interests that, and I like the talk I gave in the fall, sort of, I spent more time on this, like figures like the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation were very invested in this idea of justifying the level of economic inequity they had attained, right? Carnegie grew up in a poor working class family in Scotland who was radical politically, always critiqued power, always critiqued politicians, always critiqued the wealthy. And then he goes in the US and he becomes one of the richest men in history. And he's kind of like, he's sort of like filled with a type of guilt, right? Because he feels like he's abandoned his own sort of family origins, right? And these political commitments. But the way that he rationalizes it is through eugenics, right? Because eugenics says there's a normative and natural order to society and that white men like him are on the top of it. And so that some people are built to lead, right? And some people are built to dig, right? And he was one of the people who was built to lead. And so the system that he really works to set up, and he uses a tremendous amount of wealth to do that, justifies the level of inequity that he is invested in. So in a lot of ways, I think we're living in Andrew Carnegie's world, John Rockefeller's world, 120 years after these things came into place. But it speaks to how influential they were, how much influence they had in society because of the amount of wealth they had acquired, right? So, do we have to stop?
We have to stop.
Okay.
But thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you.
And thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you all for coming out. Yeah.